The morning of May 24th, 2000 in Gwacheon, South Korea was sticky with the humidity of summer. Gwacheon is a planned city, a clean, orderly, and prosperous suburb that was carved out of the landscape just south of Seoul to house people who would work there. It's a city of mostly government complexes, of manicured public parks, and high-rise apartment buildings. It is, by all accounts, a pretty peaceful, uneventful place where families raise their children. And it was on this peaceful morning that a city sanitation worker on his routine route through the Central Park area lifted a black trash bag into his truck. It was much heavier than it should have been, with a strange, dense weight that felt wrong. As he carried it, the black bag started to tear, which showed him what was inside. Wrapped in sheets of plastic was a human ankle. While the evidence of his crime was being discovered, 24-year-old Eun-seok was in his family's apartment on the first floor nearby. For the past 3 days since overnight on May 21st, he had been busy meticulously and gruesomely erasing the evidence of his crimes. He had been cleaning the bathroom until it was spotless, scrubbing away any evidence of what he had done there. The grout, the drain, the space between the counter and the sink. He was bleaching and scrubbing everything. He had run his clothes through the laundry multiple times just to make sure to soak out any bloodstains. He did all of this while a calm feeling of relief came over him. He was working on a difficult but satisfying project, not panicking about being caught. And in the midst of all of this, he had even taken a break to walk to a nearby hair salon to get a haircut. And in the midst of the disposal of their bodies, he even took a break to get a haircut. To the outside world, Eun-seok was a quiet, introverted student who attended a prestigious university. He was a ghost haunting that school. He never acknowledged anyone or talked to anyone else. But at home, he was both a survivor and a killer. He discarded his parents' bodies, disposed of every piece of them he cut away. And the discovery of his crimes made the world label him a monster. But the pages of his diary revealed he, too, was a victim. The question he asked himself conflicted all who would listen. Am I a servant of Satan, or am I a piece of trash that should just end his own life? Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Maziko. Thank you to my amazing patrons for making this show possible. You can support Korean True Crime on Patreon today. Join us on Discord for movie nights featuring films based on real crimes. If you would like to chat with me and other listeners, join us on Discord. All of my merch, including Korean True Crime logo shirts and sweatshirts, are now available on the Fourth Wall shop. Warning: today's episode contains discussions on child abuse, neglect, and parricide. Listener discretion is advised. To understand how Eun-seok found himself cleaning up his family's blood, questioning if he himself was a spawn of Satan, we must understand what he says drove him to it. Before the crime, there was the picturesque E family. On paper, the E family was a portrait of success. They were respectable, upper middle class, and were a family of generations of hard workers who had worked hard for what they'd achieved. The patriarch of the family was 60-year-old Lee Hyun-soo. He was a man whose disciplined personality had been hardened by the military. He graduated from the Naval Academy and served as a Marine Corps officer until he retired in 1986 as a lieutenant colonel. He was a man who carried himself very seriously all of the time. He was putting cleanliness up there with godliness. Order and control were pretty much the fundamental tenets of his life. No one could describe him without mentioning just how by the book this man was. Eun-soo was doing everything to command respect at all times, and he wanted to portray himself as a success to his own family as well. But some of his family would say he was quite bitter as he got older. He felt pretty wronged, like he had been denied his due because he never got very far in the military. He himself came from a household where he was living in the shadows of his older brother, and he was always judged as being second best. This is a story that his own son would begin to relate to as well. Hurt people, right? So when Eun-seok was in the military, he aimed to shoot right to the top, become a general, but he never quite got there. And the one place he did have total control, where he could always command respect, instill fear, control every single decision, well, that was his household. And standing beside him was his wife, 50-year-old Hwang Ok-nan. She came from a very different life. She came from a world of privilege and luxury. She had wealthy parents who paid for her education at Ewha Women's University, which, side note, has produced some of the world's greatest female thinkers in modern Korean history at least, so the university is incredibly prestigious. Although I couldn't find what she studied in university, but she didn't end up working after graduating because she got married. Regardless, Hwang Ok-nan was a very intelligent woman. She was also deeply religious in the Christian faith and was perfectly happy just getting married and raising a family. That's what she wanted in her life. She also seemed pretty proud to be a future military general's wife. But unfortunately, when Lee Hyun-soo never achieved this dream and his career ended up plateauing as a lieutenant colonel, she was really disappointed. Status was incredibly important in her social circle and in her family. She spent a bit over a decade bragging about her husband's career trajectory. So when it didn't come to fruition, she was a bit embarrassed and had feelings of resentment. This started to build a wall between her and her husband. Together, the couple had 2 sons. The elder son was Lee Hyun-chul. He was 26 in the year 2000. Hyun-chul had a bit of a rebellious side. Since he was young, he was always kind of pushing back against his father's military-style parenting. He had to learn to survive in a household where his father used his family to feel powerful. And his mother looked at her family like they were bringing her social image down. Hyun-chul learned to be confrontational, and he often clashed with his father. And because he did it so often, his father and mother started to just distance from him. Because he was getting good grades, was getting into a good school for university, they kind of just praised him and left him alone as the first son. By the year 2000, he was trying to be independent of his family. He attended university and moved out on his own, but all with their financial support. But Eun-seok, who was just 3 years younger than him at 23 years old in the year 2000, he was left behind. As rebellious as Hyun-chul was, Eun-seok was twice as compliant. I feel like I've seen this family dynamic, but always the opposite. I'm the youngest child, but me and my older sister were both kind of defiant kids in our own ways. But Eun-seok, he watched the fights his brother had with his parents. He learned the best way to survive in this controlling household was to put your head down and say, "Yes, sir." When his brother acted out, he put himself deeper into his studies to avoid confrontation. He was a model student with an IQ of 138, which makes him a literal genius. That's a lot of pressure to put on a child, though, because his parents were expecting perfection. Eun-seok would go on to become a student at Korea University, which is one of the top 3 schools in the country, and he would continue to be studious, quiet, and dutiful. His parents were proud of his perfect attendance awards, clean record, but from the outside, he was the perfect son, created by his parents' perfect parenting. He was the son with all of the pressure to bring honor to their family. So unlike Lee Hyun-soo's overshadowing older brother, his son, Lee Hyun-chul, lived watching his younger brother be forced to succeed in what he refused to endure. And from the outside, the parents presented both of their sons as successful men. Lee Hyun-chul escaping was framed as a man who wanted his independence and to achieve his dreams. But this image was just covering just how toxic and violent the reality of that household really was, and how it would end up breaking Eun-seok entirely. But before we get into the crime, it's important to understand how the crime of parricide is viewed in South Korea. Of course, murdering your parents is frowned upon in, I can confidently say, pretty much every culture around the world. But in a country that highly values filial piety, such as South Korea, it's worse than murder itself. It violates the natural order, the bedrock of society. 존속 살해, the murder of one's ascendants. It's the ultimate taboo. Respect for one's family, elders, isn't just a virtue that everyone says they value and follow. No, it genuinely shapes how everyone interacts. As someone with a background in sociology as well, I really enjoy learning about the little things that kind of shape our day-to-day interactions that we don't even realize differ from other cultures. But like I'm saying, murdering your parents is seen as much worse than any other form of crime. In this case, the facts of what happened in their home have never been disputed. The act of horror was self-evident, but the story that came out during the investigation and the trial would kind of force Korea to think about a very deeply uncomfortable question. Can a crime that is so horrific, that is beyond understanding, and is unforgivable, can that crime also have a motive that is simultaneously understandable and borders on justifiable? Well, if you come to an answer to that question, please let me know. At its core, the family home should be a place of safety and love. But for Eun-seok, his home in Gwacheon was not a home. It was just an apartment, sterile, silent, and loveless. The only constants in his life were tension and fear after his parents decided they couldn't force their eldest son to conform, so they moved on to him. He became a target for all of their disappointments. Just looking at the physical layout of the home showed that there was trouble in paradise. The parents slept in separate bedrooms across the apartment from each other. Although this isn't always an indication of problems, sometimes your spouse just snores. But for this family, it was because Hwang Ok-nang couldn't stand the sight of her own husband. Lee Hyun-chul, the older son, recalled that when he was a child, he visited a friend's house for a sleepover and was shocked to find that the parents even shared a bedroom. He thought everyone's parents had to sleep in separate rooms. To the boys, the cold distance between their parents was just the natural state of the world. Parents don't love each other. So I hope that sets the scene for what their home life was like. Lee Hyun-soo, their father, ran the home like he was in the military still, and also like a prison. He was the commanding officer and his sons were failing recruits. According to Eun-seok, his dad was an extreme perfectionist. He believed it bordered on compulsion. Every single object in the house had a very specific location, and every single task had a procedure that could not be adjusted or altered in any way. He was not just particular. Before even entering the apartment, everyone had to take a duster and clean off their clothes of any outdoor particles before changing into specific indoor slippers. If either of the boys didn't fully, enthusiastically dust themselves off, they would be punished, oftentimes physically. His parenting wasn't just about physical order. It was also emotional control, though. He talked to his sons like they were projects to be managed. He talked about them in front of them as if they were an unfinished work order. The only time he even directly addressed them as his children was to scold and criticize them. And more often than not, he just didn't address them or recognize they were even in the same room as him. But when he did, Eun-seok said it was constant verbal abuse. For example, Lee Hyun-soo called his sons 곰뱅이 같은 자식, good-for-nothing, worthless children. Despite rarely speaking to his kids, he was constantly around them. When Eun-seok studied, his father would stand over his shoulder watching the entire time, for hours. To check his progress, see how long he spent on every page, question why he needed to erase something or why he got an answer wrong. It was a suffocating environment for the boys, and the relentless surveillance they couldn't escape put them into a natural state of fear. It wasn't just their father, though, and he wasn't even the worst one. The father was that cold, controlling tyrant, but Hwang Ok-nan was the real one calling the shots. She was fabricating their entire image. Outwardly, she was this devout religious pillar of her church who gave freely, helped selflessly, and prayed warmly. But at home, she was an evil, frustrated woman. The psychological reports compiled after the crime would diagnose her posthumously as having histrionic personality disorder, which is defined by pervasive patterns of excessive emotionality and the desperate need for attention. These are people who have rapidly changing moods. They seek attention by any means necessary, and they have a very distorted self-image. Her abusive tactic was verbal and emotional violence. She constantly told Eun-seok that he had no future and no potential. despite him being a literal perfect student and a genius. She would scream at him that he was better off dead and that she wished he was dead, daily. The verbal abuse was constant, and she would berate him for the simplest of things. At dinner, she would yell at him for not eating fast enough. She would keep yelling at him to eat faster and faster until he had to shovel all of the meal on his plate into one bite, causing him to vomit. As well, since the parents had given up on criticizing the older brother, Eun-seok only ever saw the older brother receive praise, which was probably just neutral talk, but it looked like praise to him. Of course, the praise wasn't actually to the older brother, it was about him in front of Eun-seok for the sole purpose of making him think he wasn't as good as his brother. Hwang Ok-nan was psychologically playing games with him and trying to make him think that the older brother was more favored. But in a way, they did favor Hyun-chul. And I'm not sure really what prompted that. Eun-seok went above and beyond the achievements of his older brother. When Hyun-chul went to serve his military service even, he went in for 26 months. His parents visited him almost every weekend. But when Eun-seok served for 30 months, they didn't visit him a single time. Not once. On top of this, his entire life, his birthday went ignored, while his brother received normal gifts and parties. His academic achievements went ignored. He later even told the police, "I just wanted to be treated like a human being by my own family." The apathetic abuse reached its height after Hyun-chul moved out. His parents bought his brother an apartment, which was so expensive they had to take out a substantial loan. And that loan, they took it out in Eun-seok's name. He was 23, now riddled with debt that would be in his name and being used to fund his older brother's life. It's no wonder that his brother who escaped would later say the most powerful indictment of their parents by saying, "I understand, my brother." This living hell wasn't just confined to the household. Throughout Eun-seok's life, he was bullied by everyone. He was small for his age, and the doctors found out that his growth had been stunted by stress and anxiety from his home life. He was quiet, introverted, and awkward. At school, his classmates called him names, and on multiple occasions, he was physically beaten. This bullying even followed him into the military. The Korean military, much like many hyper-masculine environments, is where those who prey on weaknesses thrive. He was treated very poorly, physically beaten, berated, had nowhere to escape. Home was literal hell, and outside of home was just as bad. He had nowhere to go. 10 days before the murders, in what seemed like a last-ditch effort to change things, he sat his parents down and presented them with his diary. He had been keeping a diary since he could literally write. He had documented his life. He mostly was addressing his mother, but he wanted her to see that he had written down a lifetime of suffering that he'd been hiding since he was young. And when he showed her this, he didn't scream like she did to him. No, he just asked her to understand how he felt. But she didn't want to be criticized. He just asked her to acknowledge how she had wronged him. He wanted an apology for destroying his childhood. Of course, she showed no empathy. No apologies were made. She told him it was his fault for being weak and for being a pathetic son, and then just went on another screaming tirade. He had built up so much of his courage to show her that diary, but he still had hope for her. He had this hope that she loved him, but that invalidation, that broke him. He said that he finally decided his parents weren't just bad people. They were irredeemable. And for the next week, he holed up in his room planning 23 years of anger, sadness, hurt. It was all being put into a plan. In the pre-dawn hours of May 21st, 2000, Eun-seok sat in silence in his family's apartment. He came out of his room and went to his father's liquor cabinet and took out the most expensive imported bottle of liquor he could find. For a son who had never rebelled, or let alone drank in any way, this act was to be defiant, but also to build courage for what he was planning to do. He drank about half of the bottle and immediately felt the effects. He picked up a hammer that he had been keeping under his computer desk and walked past his father's room, across the home to his mother's room. She was, in his mind, the source of all of his emotional wounds. He stood in her doorway looking at her. She was asleep. He raised that hammer and struck her as hard as he could in the head 3 times. She was dead before she could even react or make a noise. Eun-seok turned, left the room, and went back to his own. He stayed in his room for 4 hours. He just sat, thinking. The choices he made that day were not impulsive, they were not explosive. He had a lot of silent contemplation time to think about what he was going to do and what he had done. For those 4 hours, he sat in his room, his dead mother lying in her bed down the hall. He would say that he was so worried and anxious about what he had done, he couldn't build the courage to go to his father's room. But then he got scared. The sun was coming up, and he was afraid his father would wake up. He told himself, I have to act now. At 9 that morning, he decided to once again grab the hammer, and this time he walked to his father's room. Just like his mother, he found his father asleep and struck him in the head 3 times. He later told investigators that he was terrified of the bodies and of what he had done. He wanted to make it all disappear and to forget that it had even happened. The dismemberment of the bodies was not done as an act of rage, not done to dehumanize his parents, not even revenge. He did it because he said he was so scared of them. He believed that once their bodies were gone and they were gone forever, his fears would be gone. He dragged their bodies into the bathroom and using a hacksaw, a pair of scissors, and his mother's kitchen knives, he dismembered both of his parents over the next 2 days. He described this period as a complete psychological break, a total dissociation from reality. He didn't feel fear or disgust, even when he looked at himself covered in blood in the mirror. He didn't feel anything at all. He described his way of feeling as beast-like or primal, like it was an instinct of survival. Shin Min-seok, a member of the police's Criminal Psychological Analysis Advisory Committee, said that this is a sign that Eun-seok was in a state of mental paralysis. This means he was experiencing overwhelming trauma, which kicks in survival instincts. This can lead to disassociation, trembling, and even in severe cases, an inability to feel pain. Eun-seok couldn't process what he'd done, and in turn, he felt like an animal, which is ironic considering he killed his parents to feel human. From May 21st until the evening of May 22nd was when he was going through the process of dismembering his parents' bodies. He started with his mother's body. The process was much more difficult than he had anticipated, and at first, he tried to burn some of the remains in the kitchen oven, but the smoke that started to form was so disgustingly acrid, he immediately stopped. He knew the neighbors would smell something and call the fire department, so he changed his plan. He decided to cut their bodies up into manageable pieces and then wrap them in plastic garbage bags and various shopping bags. It was 3 a.m. on the 22nd when he finished. He decided to make all the bags look different. If someone was searching for the body parts, they'd be looking for similar bags, so he disguised some of them as food waste bags, even covered in leftovers from the fridge. The bags by themselves looked like typical trash bags, those that you'd find in dumpsters or garbage collection spots. Once the sun rose, he took his first trip outside. He carried with him some of the bags, all placed inside old structured shopping bags, like the ones you would get from a department store. He looked like he had just done some shopping at the mall. He got on the subway in Seoul and rode to a farther away station. The exact locations that he disposed of the body parts have been kept private, I'm guessing to avoid people recognizing that they'd ridden the train next to him and being shocked. But whatever the reason, it really isn't important. He got off at his destination and he walked into the busiest part of the terminal, just went up to a public trash can and dropped in the bag. He turned around and got right back on the train to go back home and do it again. On his way back, he stopped at a grocery store and got some cleaning supplies. The 23rd, he went through the same routine. He took another trip on the subway to a new location in the opposite direction and disposed of more body parts in another public trash bin. On his way home, he stopped at a hair salon and got a haircut. This is kind of what stunned the investigators. They believed he was truly an emotionless monster. But psychologists rather believe that this was an act of disassociation. That night, he disposed of more bags in the trash areas around the apartment complex because it was trash collection night. By the next morning, the 24th, he had completely disposed of every part of his parents, scrubbed the home spotless. laundered his clothes, and thrown them away. He spent the next several hours going over every part of the bathroom with bleach. And as he cleaned, he was just hours away from a knock on his front door that would bring an end to what he believed was the perfect plan. In the early hours of the 24th, the sanitation worker had found one of the body parts, an ankle, after one of the trash bags ripped. At first, the sanitation worker thought this was a piece of pork or a mannequin piece, but the closer he looked at it, reality set in. He recognized the shape of a human foot and ankle. He called the police, and the entire park and every trash dump in the area became a crime scene. They started collecting every single trash bag they could find in the area, which quickly they started collecting more body parts. They found a human hand in one of the bags, but what terrified them was that the hand did not belong to the same person as the ankle. One was female, one was male. The police's first thought was that this was an act of a serial killer. They noted that the dismemberment was crude, done very hastily, but the disposal seemed to be very well planned. They had no suspects, no idea who had done this, so they moved quickly to get the body parts into forensics for DNA. Because they had found the hand, they had intact fingerprints. So their top priority was identifying this victim, and the hand came back from the national database as Eun-seok. He was a retired Marine Corps lieutenant colonel. All of his information, fingerprints, DNA, everything were in the system, so it was easy to identify him, and then easy to identify his wife as well. Within hours of finding the first body parts, they were at the front door of the E family's apartment. When the detectives arrived at that first floor apartment, they found the door locked and the lights off. It appeared nobody was home, so they knocked loudly, announcing they were the police. At first, they kind of thought no one would respond. They'd be able to make their way inside, investigate, but then the door opened just a crack. Eun-seok looked pale and sick, but not panicked. He just peered through the door. The detectives explained to him that they were looking for Lee Hyun-soo and Hwang Ok-nan. They lied and said that the couple had been reported missing and they were concerned about their well-being. Because, of course, the police didn't know how long the couple had been dead at this point or what had happened to them prior to being murdered, they were acting on the assumption that anyone inside the home was going to be their top suspect. The detective speaking to Eun-seok said that he was calm. He also wasn't showing any concern to what they said. Eun-seok responded that his parents went to church a few days ago and he hadn't seen them since. He spoke with a monotone expression and voice. To the detective who had been on the force a long while, this was a red flag. Most people, when confronted with information that their parents are missing, even if you don't like your parents, would have some form of feeling about it. Either you might get defensive for feeling accused or scared about your parents' well-being. There's a really wide variety of emotions, but he seemed like he was more in a daze. The detective knew that he was their suspect. He obtained a warrant and returned to enter the apartment. And as he walked through, Eun-seok just stood in the living room, hands clasped. They walked through the home, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The home was immaculate. Every surface dusted, floor swept, smell of bleach in the air, which the police wouldn't know, but the home was always this clean on any given day because of Lee Hyun-soo's obsessive cleaning demands. But the overwhelming smell of bleach, that's not a good sign. The forensics team arrived and started to spray luminol under black lights. Despite Eun-seok's desperate cleaning, the bathroom was glowing blue. The drains, the hammer, the floor in the hallway, it all showed signs of blood residue. Eun-seok watched them discover this, and immediately his calm demeanor disappeared. But he didn't snap. He didn't crack. It was like he breathed out a sigh, and his walls came down. He started to hysterically sob. He was brought into the police station for questioning, and he confessed to everything. He told every single detail of his life, all the way back to his childhood. He talked about the physical abuse, psychological abuse, and the emotional neglect. He talked about his father beating him, his mother berating him, and he even told them to go find his diaries. Because he was so compliant, they were able to begin the crime scene reenactment very quickly. The crime scene reenactments are often the most publicized part of an investigation. They're open to the public to watch, although the public really isn't invited to them. Reporters and gawkers usually just stand outside taking pictures and watching. Some reporters are invited inside. I feel conflicted about the publicity of these crime scene reenactments because they're not done after the criminal's convicted. They're not even done after the criminal confesses always. They're done when they're still a suspect. So in a few cases, we've even discussed an innocent person is paraded as a murderer for onlookers to harass. For Eun-seok, his crimes were the ultimate sin in Korea. So his reenactment drew a huge crowd. They brought him up to his home wearing a black cap and a surgical mask, that kind of typical identity-obscuring outfit that they put on suspects. Reporters entered the home with the police, and Eun-seok was televised, telling everyone what happened. He walked them through everything he did. He showed them where he got the hammer, how he entered his mother's room and struck her, and where he sat during his 4-hour anxiety-induced freeze. He reenacted it with a very somber look on his face, the kind of nothingness you have on your face after crying for too long. After the reenactment, his confession had been signed and his trial was scheduled. The media was calling him 인면수심. It's an idiom that means to have the face of a human, but the heart of a monster. We might say a devil in disguise. As his case moved to trial, the defense tried to build a counter-narrative. They couldn't and weren't trying to dispute the facts of the case because Eun-seok was fully cooperating and confessing. Instead, they presented his diary entries and everything I've discussed about his upbringing. He was the primary witness in the case as well. And his diary entries were heartbreaking records of a child growing up in what already seemed like a prison. In a diary entry he had written in middle school, he wrote, "Can I ever succeed? When at home, I'm just a hopeless, persecuted wretch." His diary entries were detailed, and mostly these were streams of thoughts he was having. He seemed to write in his diary to have somewhere to vent. It's surprising he was able to hide these diaries all of that time. But his parents seemed to care more about controlling him than worrying about him outing them for their abusive parenting. The court listened to all of his diary entries, most of which are not available for us to read, but there are some interesting interviews with Eun-seok where he talks about his experiences. My sources are always free on Patreon, just as a reminder, so anyone can do some more reading. There's too much in the case for me to discuss in just this episode. The defense then called another witness, his brother Lee Hyun-chol. No one could really anticipate how he would feel about his younger brother who had just murdered their parents. Of course, he probably had very mixed emotions, but he refused to speak ill of his brother. He talked about their upbringing and how cold it was, and he corroborated every single diary entry and validated that their lives were a living hell. But Eun-seok bared the brunt of his mother's anger. Then Hyun-chol spoke to the judges and begged them to give his brother leniency. This is when he said, "I can understand my brother." When this became public, the entire narrative around the case flipped. Despite this being an unforgivable crime, the public started to confront how difficult it was to make a moral stance on this case. Eun-seok was both a victim and a killer. And what this case made the public look at was the dark side of the Korean family, the immense pressure of the country's education system, social hierarchy, and the hidden epidemic of child abuse that's often ignored behind closed doors of respectable families. When I say that there was one of the most unified waves of public sympathy in this case, I'm not exaggerating. People started sending Eun-seok letters, books, money, everything. I think many people saw a reflection of their own pains, their own experiences with familial pressure and emotional neglect. Eun-seok's case spearheaded a lot of funding and support for child abuse and neglect foundations. Because the case was garnering so much attention, there was a profound dilemma in sentencing this case. On one hand, there was this brutal, undeniable fact of the case. He did murder 2 people. He desecrated their corpses, scattered their remains for a poor sanitation worker to find. And on the other hand, there is an argument that this was an act of self-preservation, self-defense, after years of abuse. In the first trial, they had to admit that regardless of the circumstances, we cannot excuse murder, so he was sentenced to death. But his attorneys appealed the sentencing, and in the second trial in higher court, they saw the case a little differently. They commuted his sentence, acknowledging that he is a victim of domestic violence, and agreed that they can't be much more lenient, so they gave him a life sentence instead. They decided that his crime was unforgivable, but they also acknowledged that his crime was understandable given his circumstances. Eun-seok has been very forthcoming about his experience. He's spoken to a few select reporters about his life. There have been books written about him as well. He has said, "I committed a crime worthy of death. I will pay the price for my actions. It's terribly painful. I do regret it." But he also revealed that there was no love lost. He stated, "I don't think of them as my real parents. They were obstacles in my life." At first, I felt really conflicted about this case as well, until I heard his response to being asked if he killed them for inheritance or money. He replied, "No, I just wanted to be treated like a human being by my family." If we want to look at how this happened, what Eun-seok did is so antithetical to our idea of what a family should be and being a good person. But really, there isn't a single explanation because another person in his same life might never have lashed out. Hyun-chul just decided to escape this after all. But I'm not here to make excuses for Eun-seok. Rather, I want to understand the path that led him to believe that this was his only possible solution. It's crucial that we look at criminologist Dr. Kathleen Hyde's work on understanding children who kill their parents, also known as parricide. She studied hundreds of these cases and found that killers like Eun-seok fall into a very specific typology called the severely abused child. These are not cold, calculating kids who kill for inheritance. According to Hyde's research, the vast majority of kids who kill their parents are victims themselves. They are the product of long-term, inescapable abuse. Their home is a prison, their parents are abusive, and violence may be a daily reality for them. And for them, the act of killing their parents is less an act of aggression than it is a desperate act of self-preservation. In a way, it is defensive. It's a cornered animal finally lunging to bite. Eun-seok lived under constant emotional and physical abuse by his parents, and he reached a breaking point. We also learn from sociologists like Robert Merton that crime, such as murder, often happens when there's an unbearable gap between what society tells you should have and the legitimate means to achieve that. The fundamental goal for a child is a loving, supportive family. Eun-seok's life was incomplete, and he knew it. He saw it everywhere. He saw it when he went to school, saw other families, when his brother discovered that other households don't have parents that hate each other. And this created strain in both of their lives. Of course, I've talked about strain theory before because I find it fascinating. But when Eun-seok found himself unable to obtain love and acceptance from his parents after pouring his heart out to them, that was his last attempt. He had no support, no therapy, no means of escape, nothing for his feelings to get out, no way to escape feelings of fear or hurt. We also need to look at his environment as a whole. We know from criminologist Lonnie Athens that individuals who commit grievous violence often go through a series of stages in their lives. Eun-seok clearly went through at least two of these. Two of these stages are brutalization and belligerency. For 2 decades, Eun-seok was subjected to daily physical and psychological abuse that taught him this is what life is and this is how people are going to treat you. That's brutalization. Then belligerency happens. This is a decision that he would no longer be passive. It's the decision that if you're pushed too far, you'll use violence to stop that pain. In the 10 days before the murder, after he attempted to reason with his mom, it was clear that he entered into this stage. Now, this is a little aside. Something I found the most interesting about Eun-seok's life was that he was obsessed with cinematography, movies. They were his escape. He wanted to consume stories that helped him make sense of his life. He also really enjoyed writing film review. He was renting about 3 to 4 movies a day, and movies were his only way to make friends. In high school, he actually had made many friends online in a film club he joined. He said, "I know how to distinguish between film and reality," when reporters questioned about if his love of film influenced him to kill his parents. And it's no wonder his favorite film of all time was Edward Scissorhands. Because take this film where a monstrous creation is alienated from a world, can't get close to anyone without hurting them or getting hurt. It's clear he saw himself in this film. And even in his review of the film, he wrote that he felt they both, him and the monster, were incomplete, unfinished products. Later in an interview, he also stated that he believed his parents suffered because they gave birth to a monster like him. and he couldn't understand why he was born into this world. Then in another film review, he stated that he really enjoyed the movie Natural Born Killers, one of his most rented movies. He was in high school when this movie came out. He had even written an analysis of the film on social media. He wrote, and I quote, "The movie emphasizes that the two main characters, Mickey and Mallory, had an unfortunate family environment. However, that is only the minimum necessary condition for murder. It's absurd to say that one becomes a murderer just because one was abused by one's parents. It just shows that they didn't grow up in a normal family." This is ominously foreshadowing for him to write this in high school. He posted this on October 23rd, 1995. If he believed that this alone couldn't drive a person to murder their parents, then what was his reason? Or was he trying to convince himself he wouldn't go through with it 5 years before he did? Some of the other films he rented, we won't go through all of them, but some of them were Broken Arrow or Unbowed, which we actually watched on a Discord movie night. We talked about the Arrow of Justice case episode. He didn't rent this film because it was beautifully made. No, the movie really isn't that amazing. He rented it to watch it as a movie night with his mom and dad together. He wanted to have a family that did things together. He wanted a loving family, but his attempt didn't work. Although he says this isn't his favorite film, one of the films that really influenced him early on was Taxi Driver. He even used the online screen name of Travis, which is the name of the movie's antihero. He took on this kind of persona online. He wanted to be this cool man, observing the filth of the world from afar. And like the film, he did an act of extreme violence for what he believed was bettering the world. Eun-seok's life was isolating, cold. It left him longing for human affection, which many of these characters also experienced. He saw himself in these films. I think for many young people, this is often the case when they discover these anti-hero melancholy movies. For him, he saw these characters creating a new beginning for themselves by breaking free of their painful past or the bad in the world. He ended the lives of his parents to live free of them, but in turn, he never was able to live a free life. His story started a very painful but necessary conversation about what should a family be. Because for Eun-seok, he just wanted to be treated as human. Thank you for joining me on Korean True Crime. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it or leave a review. Check the description for a link to our Discord, Patreon, and to find new merch. Find my sources for free on Patreon. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.